The drums echoed across the dunes, a deep, steady rhythm, boom, 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 rolling through the endless sands of North Africa. The morning sun spilled gold over the horizon, and the wind carried the scent of dust, sweat, and iron. Shadows of soldiers stretched long across the desert, as if the ghosts of old battles had returned to watch once more. This was not just another morning. It was the calm before destiny. For 16 long years, Rome had lived in fear of one man, Hannibal Barca. To the Romans, his name was a storm that never ended, a nightmare whispered by mothers to keep their children quiet. Sleep or Hannibal will come. They meant it. Hannibal, the son of Carthage, had sworn an oath before the gods as a child to never be a friend to Rome, and he kept that oath with terrifying precision. His mind was sharper than any blade, his will unshakable, his strategies beyond the imagination of his enemies. Years earlier, he had led an army across the frozen Alps, an impossible feat no one believed could be done. Soldiers, horses, and even war elephants marched through blizzards and death itself, and when he emerged on the other side, he unleashed destruction upon the Roman Republic. At the river Trebia, he crushed Rome's legions in the cold mud. At Lake Trasimene, he turned fog and silence into weapons, ambushing tens of thousands of men. And at Cannae, he orchestrated one of the greatest tactical victories in history, surrounding and annihilating nearly an entire Roman army. After Cannae, Rome's glory was drowned in blood. The fields were littered with the fallen. Entire generations of sons never returned. The Senate whispered in panic. Senators debated surrender. The people prayed to every god they knew. Imagine the streets of Rome in those years, torches flickering under dark skies, mothers clutching their children, whispering names of the dead. Veterans limped home, haunted by what they had seen, the elephants, the screams, the man in the dark cloak leading them. Hannibal became more than human. He became legend, terror, and fate. Yet despite his victories, Hannibal could not break Rome's spirit. The city refused to fall. Instead, it learned. In the heart of that wounded republic, a young soldier was watching Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was barely more than a boy when he saw his father's army destroyed by Hannibal. But where others saw fear, Scipio saw something different, a lesson. He studied Hannibal's moves, his patience, his unpredictability. He began to understand the mind behind the chaos. Scipio rose through the ranks, not because of birthright, but because of brilliance. He rebuilt what was broken, turning despair into discipline. His words inspired the weary Rome is not finished, Rome endures. While Hannibal waged war in Italy, Scipio carried the fight to Africa, striking Carthage's homeland. His campaign forced the Carthaginians to call their greatest son home. Now, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Hannibal would face an enemy who understood him. The world held its breath. Somewhere in the North African plains, 2 armies gathered, tens of thousands of men, restless horses, and the thunder of 80 war elephants waiting to charge. The dust in the air shimmered like fire under the sunday. Between them stood 2 minds that had shaped an era. On one side, Hannibal Barca, the veteran, the strategist, the legend. On the other, Scipio Africanus, the student, the innovator, the rising star of Rome. 2 men who had never met yet, had fought each other for years through the pages of history, were finally to stand face to face. A Carthaginian messenger rode through the lines, delivering silence. No words were needed. Both generals knew what this meant. The time for strategy was ending. The time for fate had come. As the sun climbed higher, soldiers tightened their armor straps. The ground trembled beneath marching feet. Across the wind, the drums began again, slow, certain, echoing like the heartbeat of the gods. This was Zama, year 202 BC. Here in the dust and heat of Africa, the destiny of empires would be decided. The greatest general Rome had ever feared was about to meet the man who would finally end his legend. The world was watching, and history was waiting to be written. The dust from Zama's plains had not yet settled in memory when our story turns back to the years before the final clash. Before the roar of elephants, before the thunder of legions, there was a young Roman who refused to bow to fear, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was no ordinary soldier. He was a man forged in the fire of defeat. As a boy, he had stood among the broken survivors of Cannae and watched Rome's pride crumble. He had seen grown men heroes lose their courage, yet deep inside him something different took root. While others trembled at the name Hannibal, Scipio whispered it like a challenge. In the quiet halls of Rome, he studied every move Hannibal had ever made, his ambushes, his traps, the way he turned nature itself into a weapon. To defeat a genius, he once said, you must learn to think like one. Rome was changing, and Scipio became its symbol of renewal. He called upon the soldiers who had once known only loss and taught them something Rome had forgotten: adaptability. His camps were not filled with speeches about vengeance, but with lessons about movement, patience, and precision. Steel clashed against steel from dawn till dusk. Again, he commanded, his voice cutting through the wind. And they did. Over and over until sweat turned the ground to mud. Under his leadership, discipline became art. The rigid formations that once crumbled under Hannibal's cunning now learned to bend and strike like water. Rome was no longer just a hammer, it had become a blade. But Scipio knew he needed more than training. Hannibal's greatest weapon had not been his elephants or his numbers, it was his cavalry. And so Scipio turned his eyes to Numidia, the land of swift riders and desert kings. Massinissa, the young Numidian ruler, was fierce, unpredictable, and proud, a mirror of Scipio himself. Their first meeting crackled with tension. Rome asks for my riders, Massinissa said, his tone sharp. Not asks, Scipio replied calmly. Invites you to victory. The two men stood face to face, the wind whipping between them like a living thing. Then Massinissa laughed, a deep, honest sound. Then let us ride to it. And so an alliance was born, one that would change the course of history. As weeks turned into months, the Roman and Numidian camps pulsed with energy. The clang of forges, the neighing of horses, the murmur of strategy whispered under torchlight, all blended into a rhythm of preparation. The soldiers began to believe again. Hope, once fragile, hardened into conviction. Scipio often walked alone at night, past the rows of sleeping men. He would pause, listening to the faint clatter of armor in the distance, and think of Hannibal somewhere across the sea, perhaps doing the same. Two minds circling each other in silence, bound by the same destiny neither could escape. Far away in Carthage, another fire was burning. Hannibal had returned from Italy after 16 relentless years of war. His face was older now, the sharpness in his eyes tempered by the weight of time and loss. The Senate of Carthage, desperate and divided, begged him to lead once more. He said little. Words were no longer his weapon. Action was. In the flickering light of the Carthaginian war room, maps were unfurled, generals argued. Hannibal listened, silent as stone, before finally speaking. We fight them here, on our soil. Let Rome taste what fear feels like again. Outside, the city prepared. Blacksmiths hammered weapons day and night. Boys barely of age took up spears. Carthage, bruised but unbroken, would rise one last time behind its greatest son. And across the sea, Scipio watched the horizon, knowing what that meant. He whispered to the wind, almost in reverence, "He's coming." The news spread through the camp like wildfire. Hannibal was returning. Men looked to Scipio for assurance. He gave none through words, only a steady nod. Confidence radiated from him, quiet and unshakable. The drums began again. Horses were saddled, blades sharpened. Two worlds, one reborn and one refusing to die, moved toward the same point in history. And as the armies began their march, the narrator's voice fades into the hum of war. Two generals, two destinies, two reflections of greatness, walking toward each other through the desert wind. The march ended when the sun rose over the desert. A blinding line of light stretched across the horizon, spilling over bronze helmets and spear points until the entire plain shimmered like a sea of fire. The air trembled with the low rumble of elephants, 80 giants restless in their chains. Their handlers whispered to them, trying to calm the beasts that sensed the coming storm. Scipio rode along his front line, the crimson of his cloak snapping in the wind. He said nothing for a long time, only looked at his men's faces, scarred eyes unflinching. Then his voice broke the stillness. Today, he said, we end what our fathers began. Across the field, Hannibal watched. His expression was calm, almost serene, but Inside his mind moved like a storm. He arranged his army in 3 layers, mercenaries in the front, hardened Carthaginian veterans behind them, and his most loyal soldiers, the men who had followed him through Italy at the rear. The elephants stood before them all, their tusks capped with iron, their trunks painted red for war. He raised his arm and a single horn sounded. The ground shook. 80 elephants charged. From the Roman lines came no panic, only motion. Scipio had anticipated this. He shouted orders and the legions opened narrow corridors in their formation. Trumpeters blared countersounds to confuse the beasts. The great animals, blinded by dust and noise, veered sideways, crashing through their own lines. Screams echoed as chaos tore into Carthage's front ranks. Scipio seized the moment. Forward, the Roman infantry surged ahead. Shields, locked swords drawn, they moved like a living wall. Spears clashed, sand turned dark with blood. The first wave of Carthaginian mercenaries fought savagely, but discipline began to break. The narrator's voice deepens. Imagine the heat, the weight of armor, the smell of iron and sweat. You can hear the rhythm of breathing, the pounding hearts, the sharp cry of command in Latin and Punic echoing through the storm. Hannibal signaled the second line forward, steadying the tide. He rode along his men, his tone calm but cutting through the roar. "Hold your ground. Remember Carthage." For a time, the balance returned. The lines ground together like the teeth of 2 giant gears. Neither side yielded. Then came the thunder of hooves. From the right flank, Massinisa's Numidian cavalry swept in a blur of sand and steel. Their horses moved as if born of the desert itself, striking at the Carthaginian flank, circling, retreating, striking again. On the opposite side, Roman cavalry pressed in, driving Hannibal's riders back. The battlefield became a storm of dust. Visibility vanished. Men fought shadows. Orders dissolved into instinct. Scipio rode through the chaos, shouting above the noise, "Keep formation, push them back!" His standard-bearer followed close, the Roman eagle glinting through the haze. At the center, Hannibal dismounted, his boots sinking into the blood-soaked sand. He drew his sword not as a symbol but as a promise. Around him, his veterans tightened ranks. They fought with the quiet fury of men who had nothing left to lose. For a heartbeat, the Carthaginians pushed the Romans backward. Spears splintered. Shields shattered. The desert itself seemed to tremble beneath their will. Then in the distance, a sound rose above everything, the returning gallop of cavalry. Scipio looked toward the horizon and saw it, dust swirling like a second storm. Massinisa's riders had broken through and were circling behind Hannibal's army. The trap was closing. Panic rippled through the Carthaginian ranks as horsemen crashed into their rear. The once orderly formation folded in on itself. Hannibal shouted commands, rallying pockets of resistance, but the sound of his voice was lost in the roar of thousands. From above, it might have looked like a whirlpool of men in steel spinning faster, tighter, until the center collapsed. The narrator's tone slows. Through the smoke and dust, Hannibal's figure flickers calm amid ruin. He watches his dream unravel, his army swallowed by the machine he once outwitted. Still, he fights, sword flashing in the dim light, refusing surrender. Scipio rides past him, eyes fixed on the horizon, knowing the battle's outcome, but not yet its meaning. The clash fades into a single drawn-out silence. The desert wind returns, carrying away the cries of the fallen. And then softly, the sun dimmed behind the smoke. The sky turned gray with dust. In that choking air, history was rewritten. The battlefield had fallen strangely quiet. Only the wind moved now, soft, heavy, carrying the scent of smoke and iron. The cries that once filled the air had faded into a distant murmur, swallowed by the endless desert. Hannibal stood alone amid the ruins of his army. The sand around him was littered with broken shields, shattered spears, and the lifeless bodies of men who had followed him across continents. His gaze drifted over them slowly, not as a general counting losses, but as a father searching for sons he could no longer save. He could still hear echoes of their voices, the laughter of campfires, the shouts of command, the chants of victory from a time long gone. Those sounds, once alive and fierce, now returned only as ghosts. Far across the field, Scipio's standards rose against the setting Sunday. The Roman legions stood in silent formation, exhausted but unbroken. Between them and Hannibal stretched a wasteland of smoke and dust, a space where history itself seemed to hold its breath. Scipio rode forward through that silence. His horse stepped carefully between the fallen hooves, sinking into soft sand. When he reached the center of the plain, he stopped dismounted and removed his helmet. He looked across at the man who had haunted Rome for nearly 2 decades. For a moment, neither moved. The wind whispered between them, carrying the sound of banners flapping and distant armor settling. It was not the silence of hatred, but of recognition. Scipio's eyes were young, but there was weight in them, the kind that comes only from seeing too much death and understanding too much loss. Hannibal's face, lined with years and battles, reflected the same truth. At last, Hannibal spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "So, it ends here." Scipio's reply was steady. "It ends, yes, but not without honor." Hannibal's lips curved into a faint, weary smile. "Honor," he repeated almost to himself. "Strange thing, isn't it? It follows us through war, but never survives it." They stood facing each other like mirrors, teacher and student, predator and heir. Hannibal studied the young Roman for a long time, then nodded slowly. "You learned well," he said. Rome finally found someone who listened. Scipio did not boast. "I learned from you," he admitted. "From every defeat you gave us. You showed us that courage without thought is ruin. You taught Rome how to think." For the first time, Hannibal's composure wavered. His eyes glistened with something that was not sorrow, not pride, but something deeper, a weary understanding. Then perhaps he said softly, "I did not lose after all." A long silence followed. The wind carried away their words as if the desert itself refused to keep them. As the sun dipped low, its red light washed over the plain, turning armor into molten gold and shadows into ghosts. The two commanders stood at the heart of it, one at the beginning of his legend, the other at the end of his. Scipio reached out his hand, not as a conqueror, but as a man paying respect to another. Hannibal looked at it, hesitated, then clasped it firmly. In that brief moment, the world seemed to pause. There was no Rome, no Carthage, only two souls who had given everything to the art of war, bound by the same fire that had consumed them both. When they released their grip, Hannibal turned away first. He walked back toward the remnants of his army, each step heavy with the weight of finality. Scipio watched him go, knowing he was witnessing the twilight of an era. The narrator's voice lowers, reflective. As darkness spread across the desert, the last rays of sunlight flickered over the fallen. No songs were sung. No cheers rose from the victors. Even Rome seemed to mourn what it had destroyed. Because on that field its Zama victory had cost something more than lives. It had taken the measure of two great men and left the world smaller for it. And when the night finally swallowed the horizon, only one truth remained. With this victory, Rome had not only defeated a man, it had conquered its own fear. The sun that had witnessed Zama's fury now sank behind the horizon, leaving a long shadow across the African plains. The smoke drifted upward like fading memories, twisting into the dimming sky. What had once been the thunder of battle was now only the sigh of the desert wind. Carthage was silent. Rome was victorious. The news spread quickly across the sea, carried by ships and whispers. In the Forum of Rome, crowds gathered as the Senate proclaimed their triumph. The banners of victory were raised, and the name Scipio Africanus echoed through the marble streets. He had done what no one before him could. He had ended the nightmare of Hannibal. But Scipio did not celebrate with arrogance. Those who saw him that day said his face held not pride but contemplation. He had seen too much of war to mistake it for glory. For Rome, the victory at Zama meant more than territory. It meant dominion over the Mediterranean, over trade, over history itself. The Republic, once threatened with extinction, now stood as the master of the Western world. The legions would march further, their banners carried to lands no Roman had yet seen, and far away across the waters, Carthage fell quiet beneath the weight of defeat. Hannibal left the city he had defended for so long. The streets that once hailed him as a savior now watched him depart in silence. He carried no treasure, no army, only the burden of memory. The man who had terrified Rome for 16 years now became a wanderer, a ghost of greatness. He traveled through foreign courts advising kings, teaching strategy, and always looking back not in regret, but in reflection. To those who met him, he remained dignified, sharp, and strangely peaceful. When asked once what had defeated him, he said simply, "Time and a student who listened." There was no bitterness in his words. Perhaps Hannibal understood something most conquerors never do, that defeat does not erase greatness and victory does not guarantee wisdom. Scipio, too, carried the memory of that day. Years later, he would return to the same soil, older and quieter, his fame already a legend. He was called Africanus, now the conqueror of Africa, but even he seemed uneasy with the title. When soldiers toasted him as the savior of Rome, he would only reply, "I saved Rome because Hannibal made her stronger." History often remembers who wins and forgets who teaches, but the story of Zama refused to fade. It became a mirror showing not the triumph of one empire over another, but the evolution of the human spirit. The narrator's tone softens. Close your eyes and imagine that field once more silent, vast, bathed in evening light. The banners are gone, the swords are rusting beneath the sand. Yet something remains, a sense that both men, in their own way, achieved immortality. Hannibal's brilliance, his courage, his relentless will, these became lessons studied by generals for centuries to come. Napoleon, Patton, and countless others would one day speak his name with reverence. And Scipio, he became the embodiment of what Rome aspired to be: disciplined, adaptable, patient. He showed that true power comes not from brute strength, but from understanding. The legacy of Zama was not written in conquest, it was written in transformation. As the music swells softly beneath the voice, the words linger. If history teaches us anything, it is that no victory lasts forever. Kingdoms rise and fall, armies win and lose, but the wisdom gained endures. Because real strength is not the power to destroy, it's the courage to learn to adapt and to respect even the enemy who made you better. The narrator pauses, voice almost a whisper now, so when we look back at Zama, we don't just see Rome's triumph or Carthage's fall. We see two men who defined an age, one who taught through conquest and one who conquered through understanding. And in that moment, across the sands of time, they are both eternal. If history teaches us anything, it is this: there is no such thing as a permanent victory, only the lessons we leave behind. As the music fades, the final sound is the desert wind, soft, endless, carrying with it the echoes of two names whispered through history: Hannibal, Scipio.